Blindfolds all in place?
On, sir.
All right, then may we welcome our next contestant, please. Will you come in? Good evening. Very nice to have you here. Now, panel, because there is an area of identification, we'll refer to this gentleman as Mr. X. Mr. X, if you'll whisper your secret to me, we'll show it at the same time to our audience. Panel, to help you with this game, the clue concerns something Mr. X did. We'll start the game with Betsy Palmer.
Mr. X, your face would be familiar to all of us on the panel because it's been in the newspaper?
I think so.
Is this something that was done as far as science is concerned, to benefit science?
No.
Was this something done with sports?
Yes.
Oh, wait a minute. Could you be possibly... Oh, could you be a very tall man? Could you?
He could be.
You know I know what it is.
Wilt the Stilt.
Yes.
Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain, there it is. All right, blindfolds off.
Get 100 points in the game, huh?
Betsy, what did you say? What did you
Get
say?
100 points in a game.
Well,
Right.
all by himself.
100 points in one game, which is the first time it's ever been accomplished.
From me,
No, I knew.
Now, this is what thrills me, is he has established a new record, 100 points in the game. The previous record, I believe, was how many points in the game, Wilt?
78.
78. And who do you think held that record, the previous record of 78? Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain. Yes, so he broke his own record. And he's approaching another record now, which is for the most points scored in any one season. How many have you scored so far this season?
3,995.
Oh.
He is 5 points short of 4,000 points. Now, any of you who have played basketball know that even when it's played as a college sport, it's a rough sport. Played professionally, it is a murderous game. Because if they can't block his shots, they give him the elbow in the side, right?
That's right.
Hoping not to get caught at it. But now, how many games will you play in a season?
80 regular season games, Gary.
80 regular season games, and then you play...
15 exhibitions and approximately 15 playoff games. Almost 110, 115 games.
110, 115 games, which average out sometime to like 6 games a week. You travel in between them and take this brutal punishment, so you know that he has to be in magnificent condition. A very modest young man, and we're very proud to have met you, Wilt. Indeed we are. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, how's it going, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is, of course, Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for swinging on by. Happy to have you. Pull up a chair, have a seat, relax, put us in your earbuds, and enjoy, will you, our little conversation this week as we go back into the life and times of perhaps one of the, if not the, debatable for sure, but certainly undeniable talents in all of basketball history. Wilt Chamberlain, fun guy, intriguing guy, Renaissance guy. We jumped at the chance once we discovered sort of the tributaries of life that intersect with our little genre of the world, and that is the things of defunctness and no longer with us kinds of things, and the story of Wilt Chamberlain. Now, it is no doubt well known and extremely well documented about just how tremendous a player Wilt Chamberlain is, and tremendous is hardly the best adjective, right? This is a guy who literally dominated. Yes, part of the NBA top 50 of all time, but, very much in that conversation when you get to the top 2 or 3 players of all time. Yeah, you can talk about LeBron James. Yeah, you can talk about Michael Jordan. Yeah, there's a whole, slew of other guys too, and big fellas who could certainly make their claim to sort of the best ever. But if you're looking for GOATs, greatest of all times, you are absolutely must have to consider the great talents and the legendary skills of Wilt Chamberlain for sure. This episode is not devoted to those exploits. They're well documented. And Lord knows our guest this week, Robert Cherry, could be the place for you. His book, the definitive biography of Wilt Chamberlain, written by our guest, Robert Cherry, Wilt, Larger Than Life, is absolutely the tome that you would want to have in your library to delve deeper into the fullest extent of the Wilt Chamberlain story. But we, as you know, in this little show, we love to get into the granular, the minutia, the oft forgotten stuff. And Wilt's career beyond basketball, frankly, also inclusive of basketball, it definitely had a few stops in our little genre. And we're excited at that prospect to go deeper with that story, that sort of less heralded part of Wilt's amazing life with our guest, Robert Cherry. For example, did you know that Wilt Chamberlain, before going to the NBA, after his collegiate career at Kansas, sat out a year back in the day because the rules didn't permit a non-graduating senior class member to go to the NBA. He played for the Harlem Globetrotters. Now, he also played for the Harlem Globetrotters while he was also in the NBA in the offseason and stuff. But Wilt's basically, his professional career got started in 1958 by playing for Abe Saperstein's Harlem Globetrotters, and already showing how a tremendous player he was back in the day before he went into the NBA. Did you know, for example, that when he did go to the NBA, that he went to the team now known as the Golden State, but then known as the Philadelphia Warriors? That qualifies for ours. That was a previously domiciled version of the current Warriors franchise. And yeah, our previous episodes that danced around the great Mr. Basketball, Eddie Gottleib, for sure part of that story and the relationship between Eddie and Wilt. Matter of fact, Wilt was essentially already promised to the Warriors by way of their regional draft rules that essentially allowed owners of the teams in the various regions to regionally claim these players. And for Wilt, it was kind of a fait accompli. Even before he went to the Harlem Globetrotters, he was going to be a Warriors player. And it was, of course, as a Philadelphia Warriors player that Wilt broke that record, that 100-point home game in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I think they didn't get the arena that night for that game, but that's where it was done. And that was the clip that you heard at the beginning here. That was from an episode of the old game show, I've Got a Secret, from, let's see, March 12th, 1962, when Wilt was it didn't last too long, the secret guest on that episode. And clearly one of the memorable moments of all time in professional basketball history. Did you know that Wilt Chamberlain was also, after his stint with the LA Lakers, a player/coach in the ABA with the team known as the San Diego Conquistadors, or the Qs, as they were lovingly remembered, and frankly, from the jersey perspective, a lot easier to sort of get in there onto the clothing. That was in 1973. They signed, the Conquistadors did, Chamberlain to be a player coach for the then princely sum of $600,000. I think that's at least $3 or $4 million in today's money. But the Lakers sued to prevent him from actually playing. So he really was kind of relegated to being just the coach part of that hyphenate. And Stan Albeck, a legendary coach in his own right, essentially as the assistant to Wilt, frankly did most of the work, if not, depending on the day in the game, all of the work, depending on who you talk to. But that was absolutely also part of Wilt's storyline, too, and lesser known. There are a couple of basketball cards actually floating around out there that I think have Wilt listed as a player coach. There's even a bunch of programs and stuff that have him mentioned it and touted as both. But lest you forget or not know, he did not actually suit up. Well, I think he did suit up. I think for publicity photos and stuff as a player for the Qs, but did not actually play for them. He just coached them from the sidelines and arguably maybe not necessarily with 100% of his energies. And we'll get into that part with our conversation with Robert Cherry coming up. But last but not least, attentive listeners to the show will also know that Wilt was a standout volleyball player. Yeah, he played volleyball and loved the sport. He's actually inducted into the Volleyball Hall of Fame. He's the only guy to be not only inducted into that, but also into the Basketball Hall of Fame. And as you may remember in some of our previous episodes, our episode with Jay Hanseth, for example, our conversation about the great film, the documentary about the IVA. He was part of the International Volleyball Association, Wilt was. He was a player and a coach. He was also a commissioner, and he was also apparently a part owner, part of the ownership group behind all of that stuff. Truly hard to believe, but this was a guy who loved the sport of volleyball, and the International Volleyball Association itself, just an absolute hoot of a story. And we encourage you to check out our previous episodes on that as well. But that's just all part of the story, the great big tableau of the story, the history, the life of Wilt Chamberlain. And yeah, we sort of we get into the how many ladies he slept with, part of the mix. And but this guy was a cultural phenomenon for sure. We keep listening intently. You'll hear a couple of clips along the way in our conversation with Robert in a few minutes. An entrepreneur, he helped, he funded track and field teams. He dabbled in real estate. He was a commercial pitchman and presenter for lots of different products and services. He was very much in demand in the television and movie circuit, made lots of guest appearances and stuff. And just a fascinating character. But these parts of it is our focus. The stuff that people don't forget or don't remember, or frankly just don't even know about his life beyond his star career as an NBA player in basketball. And that's the focus of our conversation this week with our guest, Robert Cherry, the definitive author of the definitive biography of Wilt Chamberlain called Wilt, Larger Than Life. That's our chat coming up in a few minutes. You will love it. I loved it. And I can't wait to delve into the book even further and learn more about this fascinating cat known as Wilt Chamberlain coming up in a moment's time. Let's celebrate this week, shall we, with some great stuff, commemorative of some of this forgotten and unknown history of Wilt Chamberlain. And in particular, let's get into the San Diego Conquistadors story from the ABA. Let's spin the dial and go to oldschoolshirts.com. Our pal P.F. Wilson in beautiful downtown Cincinnati. There is a wonderful San Diego Conquistadors shirt with the Conquistadors logo there. It's there in all its glory, and it comes in all kinds of different designs. You can get it in a crew neck sweatshirt or a racerback tank if you're looking for a women's version of that, or a scoop neck shirt, a unisex t-shirt. They're all there for you. Oldschoolshirts.com, and the promo code there is Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Once you're done there, hop on over to our pals at streakersports.com, the purveyors of sports culture. Promo code there is Good Seats. I think it's 2 words there. It could be 1 word or 2 words. Try them both and see which sticks. That's 15% off all of your purchases there. And there is a great 72 version of the San Diego Conquistadors t-shirt, the wordmark version, where it's the sort of the stylized, scripted San Diego Conquistadors in beautiful yellow color. And it uses in the words, the word mark there. It's the light blue, the white, and the sort of burnt red sort of color against a yellow t-shirt background. San Diego Conquistadors word mark t-shirt at streakersports.com. Again, promo code Good Seats there. And last but not least, once you're done buying that shirt, you want to head over to 503 Sports. That's 503-sports.com. sports.com. Don't forget the dash. The king of throwbacks, promo code there is SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. That's our pal Dustin Alameda out there in beautiful Portland, Oregon. And among other things, you can find the lovingly crafted San Diego Conquistadors jersey, replica jersey. It's fantastically done. You get your name on the back of it if you'd like, put numbers on it if you'd like, and there are two different versions of it. There's the beautiful, smart-looking red version that says San Diego across the front, or you can get the white, I'm guessing, home version that literally has just the stylized scripted Q apostrophe S on the front. And those in the know knew that, of course, that the Conquistadors went by the much shorter nickname appellation as the Qs. Both of those versions are there for you at 503-sports.com. Again, promo code, he says, SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. So what better ways, plural, to celebrate the San Diego Conquistadors cup of coffee that Wilt Chamberlain had in the early 1970s by then not visiting those great sites and, giving us a few shekels of referral love when you do so. Thank you to 503 Sports. Thank you to Streaker Sports. And thank you to oldschoolshirts.com for your sponsorship of the show, especially this week. And now, drum roll, please. Here we go. This is our fascinating journey into the nooks and crannies, the ones that people frankly don't remember or even know about, as we get into the depths of the fascinating life story of Wilt Chamberlain. Here's our conversation with Robert Cherry, the definitive biographer. Here it is coming up. Please, as always, enjoy. So look, you kind of know the zeitgeist of this odd genre that we sort of carved out for ourselves in podcast land, and obviously, Wilt Chamberlain is a world-class, internationally known and renowned figure, in basketball, of course, but on a lot of sort of different levels, and we'll get into some of those things. But before we get into sort of the, shall we say, the idiosyncrasies or lesser-known parts of Wilt's life, how about a little background on you and how you came to, frankly, put together the definitive, by all accounts, biography of this admitted legend in basketball and beyond?
I was thinking that if IBM or the Chinese or Japanese fastest computer were fed the information to come up with an excellent or perfect biographer for Wilt Chamberlain, that I would be one of the 5 finalists, maybe the 3 finalists. Not to say other people couldn't have written an excellent bio of Wilt, but it was the book. It's a cliche to say I was born to write. And by that, I mean, that I grew up in Philadelphia, a great basketball city. I don't know if you or your listeners know how many great college teams and college coaches came from Philadelphia, how many referees in basketball and other sports grew up in the Philadelphia area.
Oh, so we've gone back to the Philadelphia spas and all that kind of stuff, so there's no question about that.
Yeah, so I grew up in that milieu in the 50s. As Wilt said, basketball was king. Had he grown up in California, he may have played other sports or in upstate New York. So that was number one, where I grew up. Number 2, my sister was in Wilt's class at Overbrook, not just his class, but his classroom, Chamberlain, Cherry, and they were friends, and not the best of friends, but Carol, of course, knew Wilt and vice versa, and years later, she might be walking in Center City, Philadelphia, and hear somebody call her name, and it was Wilt. Number 3, I fell in love with basketball in my 20s and played basketball at Overbrook High School, long a basketball powerhouse before Wilt put it on the sports map. Throughout my life, wherever I was, including when I was in Peace Corps training in the Virgin Islands, guys who knew sports knew about Philadelphia, knew about Overbrook High School, mostly because of Wilt. But Wilt was not the first great player to graduate from Overbrook High School. Indeed, when I when the book was published, my Wilt biography in 2004, as of then, Overbrook High School had sent more of its graduates to the NBA than any other school in the country except DeWitt Clinton High School in New York. So there was, like, growing up in Philly, my sister being at Overbrook, my loving basketball, my playing 2 years of varsity basketball at Overbrook, 6 years after Wilt. I got to love sports writing through Red Smith, the wonderful syndicated columnist. I think younger readers may not know who Red Smith was, but in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, he was one of the most famous, if not the most famous, syndicated sports columnists in the country. I love sports writing and read a lot of the great sports writers. So when Wilt died and I listened to an all-news radio station and heard things that I never knew about Wilt. I thought I knew Wilt. Big house, famous star, lost too many times to Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics, et cetera, et cetera. And then I heard a story about Wilt befriending the terminally ill granddaughter of his teammate Paul Arizin when they played with the Philadelphia Warriors in the 50s, and it moved me to tears. And I said to myself, I want to write a book about Wilt. And I got up the next morning, and it still seemed like a good idea. And 5 years later, when the book was published, 3 years of research and 2 years writing it, I was happy that I started the project. So all of those reasons and circumstances and experiences led me to write Wilt's biography.
All right. So what did you, and we'll get into some of the interesting sort of curves and curvatures of the story, but what did you think you knew about him when you started the project, and frankly, what sort of revealed itself to you as you were getting into it and closing out into getting it sort of into a published form? Because I as a crack armchair historian, right? I put historian absolutely in double quotes, perhaps. I'm just curious, right? So it just becomes an amateur endeavor. But when you look at the overview of Wilt's life, I mean, you're hinting at some of it. It's a lot more complex than just being one of the best basketball players of all time. But did you know that going in, per se?
No, I did not. And I refer back to the KYW, an all-news radio station in Philadelphia. I'm sorry, WIP, an all-sports radio station, devoted 24 hours following Wilt's death to his life. And people called up with the most interesting anecdotes about Wilt. And that's, to repeat what I said earlier, that's when I said to myself, there's much more to Wilt than the stereotype or the newspaper or magazine articles Wilt about a rich, arrogant guy with a Playboy-like palace home in Los Angeles and a guy who lost to the Boston Celtics. And I said to myself, I want to find out, among other things, why Wilt's teams didn't prevail more over Bill Russell's Boston Celtics. So that was a revelation. And then as I traveled around the country during the 3 years of researching the book, I went to Kansas, where Wilt attended college 2 trips. I went to Los Angeles 3 times and started from the outside circles of people who knew Wilt to the inside circles, some of the people who knew him better than anybody, including his sister Barbara, probably the person whom he was closest to and knew so much about him, was very protective of Wilt's career and life. I learned more and more about this complicated person. And mostly I was impressed with all the nice stories that people who were intimate with him told, that he could be demanding, he could be a pain in the ass, but they had wonderful memories. He was one of those characters like Babe Ruth, like Muhammad Ali, or even more than Ali, as great as Muhammad Ali was the most charismatic athlete of his time and maybe all times, that Wilt generated great anecdotes about his amazing physical stamina, about his love life, about his generosity. just his personality he was overwhelming. He dominated every milieu, not just because of his size, but because of his persona and his charisma and his personality.
So we're going to obviously highlight on some of the sort of lesser known things here, and obviously, get the book, friends, because the story is rich and just the basketball exploits alone, right? There's absolutely, and again, generations of fans who may or may not. I mean, I think a lot of people know the name, right? They probably don't know truly just how significant. I mean, one of the 50 best players in the NBA, and I mean, just it's on and on and on. Those accolades are all there, and plain, frankly,
yeah, 50, not just name one of the 50 greatest players.
Please.
Considered by many people still the greatest of all time, though Michael Jordan, the argument is that he's the greatest people can make. And now with LeBron, I mean, Wilt was certainly one of the 5 greatest NBA players. And I claim that, and many other people, the greatest big man who ever played the game, even though the game has changed with the 3-point shot, and we could get into that in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's just pick on one of the sort of lesser known things. Although it's not, so there was a tremendous ESPN 30 for 30 short on Wilt's interesting summer, shall we say, in the Catskills during high school, and I guess I'm wondering maybe a little bit of sort of that little chapter in his life with sort of in the context of him playing in Philly. And ultimately going to Kansas to play the next level at the collegiate game. It feels to me sort of a surprising story or element of his background, but maybe you could sort of put sort of that in context, because that maybe gives a bit of a hint more of beyond just his playing prowess, what his life was like in his high school and collegiate years.
Wilt was never like anybody else when at age 5 or 7 he shot up and was a foot taller than his classmates in elementary school and then junior high. He led Overbrook to 3 championships and was the most famous high school player in the world. And when he decided to go to Kansas, and I'll get back to the Kutchers in a second, Life magazine, then the most famous and prominent magazine in the country, ran a 5-page spread on the college that Wilt chose to go to. Later on, people like LeBron and Kevin Garnett went directly into the pros from high school, and Wilt was certainly good enough. He was the best player in the world when he was probably a senior in high school. Anyway, to get to your point about Kutchers, Eddie Gottleib, called Mr. Basketball, owned the Philadelphia Warriors, and there was something called the Territorial Draft where a player who played in a high school or college in a certain geographical area could be drafted by that team, i.e. the Boston Celtics drafted Tom Heinsohn and Bob Cousy out of college. Eddie Gottlieb knew when Wilt was a high school senior that he wanted to draft and would draft Wilt. Eddie Gottlieb arranged for Wilt to become a busboy, to earn money. Wilt was always ambitious, always a worker. When he was 5 or 6 years old, he helped an iceman. He helped a guy deliver milk in the days in Philadelphia when milk was delivered by a milkman on a horse up and down the streets. And Wilt's mother finally told the milkman that his son looked much older than he was, but he was only 5 or 6 years old, and she'd rather he didn't work at that time. He always wanted to earn money. So this was an opportunity for Wilt to have a summer job, to buy money, to earn money with which he would buy cars. Wilt loved cars. He loved horses. He loved polo horses. He loved racing horses. He owned harness racing. So he worked at Kutcher's Resort, a famous resort in the Borscht Belt, Borscht being a Jewish, Russian Jewish soup. A lot of the resorts were in the Catskill Mountains. New Yorkers and other people would go there for vacation. Women would go up with their kids, and their husbands would come up on the weekends. And there were a lot of great college players who were busboys at the Kutcher's Resort and others in the Catskills. All of these places are gone, long gone. Wilt always wanted to be the best at whatever he did. So he wanted to be, and probably was, the greatest busboy. And their famous pictures that probably showed in that documentary.
So I'm sorry. So Robert, he wasn't the only sort of basketball type up there, huh? I thought it was just a completely unique thing for him. Which I'm sure he cut quite a figure, shall we say, in the summertime fun up there, huh?
On the contrary, there were other college players who were busboys and waiters at resorts in the Catskills, and they played against one another. And I have it in the book. I forget his name. Wilt destroyed in an intra-resort basketball game a reigning or an ex-All-American, then playing for an industrial team. And Red Auerbach, the incomparable Boston Celtics coach, worked at, I believe, Kutcher's, and as an athletic director or whatever, organizing sports. And Red Auerbach recognized Wilt's incomparable talent. So, and equally important, and again, this is the other side, to me, very interesting sides of Wilt. He became close friends with the Kutcher family and returned 50 years later to visit with Milton Kutcher and his wife. And I went to the Kutchers and spent a couple of days there and interviewed. Wilt was friendly with the Kutcher children. It was an intimate part of his life, a special relationship. Milton Kutcher was like a second father to Wilt. And again, he loved, there's a great story someone told. There was a car had a flat tire or something. Wilt lifted it, one of the employees for the Warriors, and the guy was afraid that Wilt was going to have a hernia. He said, "Wilt, don't do that again." It's in the book. I don't remember. It's 100,000 words, and I wrote it many years ago, so I don't remember chapter and verse, every line in the book, as I did when I wrote it and soon after it was published. So the Kutcher experience was great for Wilt. He developed a close relationship with the Kutcher family. He played against top-level collegiate players and earned money with which I think he bought an Oldsmobile. He loved cars.
And that speaks to the meticulousness of this biography, the fact he can't remember every single word of it, which is, frankly, absolutely forgivable. But I got to think, though, that exposure up there in the Catskills, amongst some other players and all of that, besides his hard work ethic and all that, probably, you hinted at Red Auerbach, I got to think that there were other people in the, shall we say, basketball or budding basketball establishment, right? Which, to set all this up, right? The reality is that the pro game, quote unquote, was still largely a Midwestern and Northeastern kind of dominated thing, right? Even it was still sort of developing itself. I got to think that there were multiple entreaties to try to get Wilt to play college somewhat locally or in these regions.
Agree.
And Kansas was absolutely not that, ultimately, right?
Well, I address that in the book, your question about why Wilt went to Kansas. This was before the days when John Wooden and UCLA dominated for the decade and a half that they did. Wilt didn't want to go down south because of segregation and the racial climate. Wilt was an adventurous person. He wanted to leave Philadelphia for new experiences. Fog Allen, was the Kansas coach. Fog Allen was one of the greatest coaches in collegiate history. James Naismith, who invented the game of basketball in the YMCA, was buried in Lawrence, Kansas, where Kansas is located. So Wilt traveled to many schools, and to be honest, he was offered money covertly or otherwise. I guess covertly means otherwise. He had inducements to attend. They offered his high school coach Cecil Mosenson a job if he could bring Wilt along, et cetera, et cetera. And for all these reasons, he narrowed the choices down to a couple of Midwestern schools. And because of the great Fog Allen and the great tradition of Kansas basketball, at one point, it's interesting. I did put it in the book. I was prepping a little for this interview. Wilt, he loved stats. He had a great memory, loved numbers. Wilt pointed out to somebody, this is as of, I don't know when it was, 1970, 1985, that Kansas graduates, there were more Kansas graduates in the Naismith Hall of Fame than any other school. Live and learn. I knew that fact. I probably forgot it over the 17 years since my book was published. Kansas had a great tradition. Fog Allen coached our Olympic team. Ironically and sadly, because of an age requirement, Fog Allen never coached Wilt at Kansas, and that's the primary reason why Wilt went to Kansas.
All right, so explain to me then why, and this sort of is another sort of, again, we're trying to go into some of the lesser-known sort of parts of the story, right? Why the Harlem Globetrotters after Kansas versus going directly to the NBA? I'm ignorant of that story and why, and some of the scenarios and situations around that, because it would obviously be, I mean, you mentioned before Eddie Gottlieb, but I can't imagine that he wasn't already trying to figure out. I mean, the fact that he was helping him get a job during the summers in high school, that he didn't have designs to, for example, to bring him back to Philadelphia to play locally for what was now becoming a much more professional Philadelphia Warriors thing that Gottlieb was getting involved with. Why the Globetrotters after Kansas? I'm
happy to answer the question. And there's so much to Wilt's life. I'll try. I hope your listeners that my questions are as concise as my answers are concise.
No, this is great. With all due respect, if people aren't more intrigued by this, and we're going to give you some more stuff. Again, it's a tremendous story. We can't do the entire life of him the justice, but I do want to unearth some of this stuff because it's really great stuff. It's fascinating to me.
Gottlieb invoked the Territorial Draft rule since rescinded in basketball NBA history, and he drafted Wilt when he was in high school. He had the rights to Wilt. There was no pro team in Kansas City. That's why. So Wilt, that was another reason he went to there. If he had gone to school in Boston, Red Auerbach could have invoked, I believe he would have had priority where a person played college. I'm not sure at that point, but it's a moot point because Wilt played in Philadelphia. Eddie Gottlieb owned the Warriors, who were based in Philadelphia. He drafted Wilt. In those years, the NBA rule was a player could not enter the NBA until his college class graduated. Wilt played 3 years, attended Kansas for 3 years. Freshmen couldn't play varsity in those years, so he was a freshman. He played his sophomore and junior year and was dissatisfied with the basketball experience. Teams were just holding the ball and beating the hell out of Wilt. At one point, he said, "I'm black and blue all over. I started out black." So Wilt's option was, I don't want to attend Kansas. I can't enter any longer, though he loved the Kansas experience. I want to earn money for my family. His parents were lower middle class, stable family. It's a key to Wilt's stability and the general good nature, a stable, lower middle class black family. Wilt's option was the Globetrotters, which he loved. In those years before the NBA was dominated by blacks, the greatest black players, blacks were not drafted, were not allowed. It was an unwritten law. Teams were not drafting blacks in the 40s and the 50s. The great black players played for the Globetrotters. Wilt, as a kid, and his high school buddies loved the Globetrotters. So it all came together. And so, additionally, Abe Saperstein, the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, had a small percentage of the Philadelphia Warriors because he and Eddie Gottlieb were buddies. So Wilt signs for a tremendous amount. I think was it 85,000 or 100,000. Big signing, was in all the newspapers, to play for the Globetrotters. And he toured Europe with them. He loved Europe. He learned European architecture and food and European women. The Globetrotters were the most favorite basketball experience of Wilt Chamberlain's life. And this is something I didn't know, and I guarantee you 99% of the people listening to this, or 97% of the basketball fans in the United States over a certain age, Wilt Chamberlain would play an NBA season, and then after the season, he would meet up with the Globies in Europe and tour with them for a couple of months. It was a significant part of his life experience. He loved it. And on the Globe, one more point. There are a million points one could make. On the Globetrotters, one of the stars was Meadowlark Lemon, who played the center, and their reps revolved around the center, and the guard would cut off, and Meadowlark Lemon would throw a behind the back pass to the cutting guard, and in Wilt's case, he would jam the ball. Wilt played guard on the Globetrotters for a year, and then improved his ball handling skills. So that's why Wilt joined the Harlem Globetrotters.
That's a completely unknown fact to me. So this basically was his fulfilling his senior year, so to speak, of eligibility. He couldn't go to the NBA. So this was a perfect way, and obviously his skills at a superior level, to essentially start playing professionally before he was allowed to play in the NBA.
Correct. It improved his ball skill, introduced him to Europe, which thereafter he loved to visit, and he made a lot of money. He was one of the highest paid athletes in the world at that point.
How ironclad was or assumed was his segue to the Warriors of the NBA? Was it effectively a done deal? How does that get officialized? Or did he have to go through some, I don't know, quote unquote process to be officially drafted and brought into Philadelphia?
The done deal since Wilt was a high school senior, and Eddie Gottleib invoked the Territorial Draft. I want to add a little bit. Eddie Gottleib was called Mr. Basketball, and as the great Harry Litwack, Temple's Hall of Fame coach back in the 50s and 60s, said, Eddie Gottleib was about as important to the game of basketball as the basketball. And that's a true statement. So it all came together that Wilt's mentor, Eddie Gottleib, the owner of the Warriors, was a very influential player, a coach, an owner, and he invoked the rule, and that's why Wilt came to the Warriors. There were no ifs, ands, or buts about it, just as Bob Cousy and Tommy Heinsohn were drafted by the Celtics, and they came to the Celtics after graduating from New England colleges.
Now, was there ever a thought that he might not want to ultimately go to the Warriors after having been claimed so early in his budding career? Or was it he just knew he was going?
Yeah, he knew and accepted it and wanted to. Philly was a great basketball city. Eventually, he became too big, I would say, for Philadelphia for lots of reasons, which we could get into. He preferred New York and Los Angeles, not least because in those years, I'm talking about the early 60s, it was more acceptable for a black man to date a non-black woman, an Asian or a white woman. And Wilt liked all colors, but he tended to date Asian or white women. And New York, not just because he could date a non-black woman, New York there were exciting places, New York and Los Angeles. Philly's a great city. I love it. I'm born and bred here and live now in suburban Philly, but they don't compare to, when you're a young man, to the glamour and glories and extracurricular activities from nightclubs to restaurants to dance, etc., to New York or Los Angeles, or they don't have the weather of California.
Yeah, so but come on, can you get a decent cheesesteak or a hoagie, frankly, in those places? No, not really. Philadelphia, it's just the locus for all those things. All right, so explain to me then, for our audience a bit, what this Philadelphia version of the Warriors was upon Wilt's arrival. We're talking basically the very last part of the 50s and early to mid 1960s before they made that move to San Francisco. Obviously, Gottlieb is part of that story too, but maybe you can kind of give us a little sense of the team, Wilt and Eddie, as they try to make a go of it in Philadelphia, and maybe how and why they ultimately went to San Francisco during that period of time.
The Warriors had a distinguished pedigree, beginning with Eddie Gottlieb's teams. Even before there was an NBA, there were more scoring champions produced by the Warriors than any other club. They were a very good club. And this is one of the points that I'm proud of in my book, maybe the most, one of the most important points I make for the reader when people say, why wasn't Wilt more successful? Bill Russell, to just take a name out of a hat, that's a joke. Of course, Russell and Wilt are linked with the greatest, or one of the greatest, if not the greatest rivalry in sports. Russell had the benefit of the stability of one coach, Red Auerbach. Throughout Wilt's career, he played for different coaches, some not very strong personalities, weak characters, some strong characters like Alex Hanneman, Frank McGuire, and Bill Sharman. And when he had a strong coach, he responded. Wilt could be ornery and knew he was the greatest, or thought he was the greatest player in the game's history. So when Wilt was the Warriors were a good team, but they were not as good as the Boston Celtics. So Wilt started in the 1959 and 60 season, and he had an amazing year. He was the first player ever to be the MVP and the Rookie of the Year. Only when Wes Unseld of the Baltimore Bullets holds that distinction. Wilt smashed every record there was his first season, yet the Warriors lost to Boston in 59-60, 60-61, 61-62, and I don't know if you want me to address it right now, why they lost to the Celtics, or if I answered your question about the team. It was a very good team. Paul Arizin was a great player. Now, let me make another equally interesting and important point about the team and the history of the NBA. The Philadelphia team in 1959 had the following people on it: Tom Gola, Guy Rogers, Ernie Beck, Paul Arizin, and Wilt Chamberlain. This is a unique story in professional sports. All five of those men were born in the same city, went to colleges in the city, Philadelphia, except Wilt, who went to Kansas, and ended up playing on the professional team of that city. It's an amazing fact, and I love to repeat it. Tom Gola was fabulous at collegiate at LaSalle. Ernie Beck set all kinds of records at Penn. He wasn't a great NBA player, a good NBA player. Guy Rogers went to Temple, was a great player. Paul Arizin went to Villanova. So it's a really unique, amazing situation that five guys grow up in a city, high school in the city, college, but for Wilt, and play on the professional team.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And look, also we're overlooking a sort of a major event, right? As Chamberlain, by the way, I mean, he was leading the team in scoring, which is, I guess, obvious, right? But it's interesting. You look at the years, his first number of years with the Warriors. I mean, he increased his points per game as the seasons went on. I mean, by the time they got to San Francisco, I mean, he was scoring, 23, 25 points per game on average. But obviously nothing eclipsed that magical moment in 62 when I guess it was a home game they were playing in Hershey when he busted
Let me
record.
explain that. In those years, the NBA in the 1950s was a struggling league. Nowhere as successful, meaning generating money like it does today or the last 20 or 30 years, like the NFL or Major League Baseball. There's I like the line, some wag said the NBA in 1956, 57, 59 were 8 guys in a phone booth smoking cigars, meaning in some sense bush league and primitive compared to what it had would become. They played, quote, home games in other geographical areas in the state. That's how Wilt and the Warriors ended up playing in Hershey, Pennsylvania in March of 1962. And that, of course, is the venue for the single most famous game in basketball history and one of the great individual accomplishments in sports when Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. in Hershey, Pennsylvania, not in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so I guess, and as we sort of segue, because I want to get into the story of why going to San Francisco and then his desire or perhaps why he didn't stick around in San Francisco. I guess the criticism, right? I mean, if you could even call it that, right? Here's a guy who is, just simply otherworldly when it comes to lighting up the scoreboard. And, the cynic would say, okay, well, here's a guy scoring 100 points and averaging, 40 points on certain stretches per game and a year season, 25, almost 30 points a game. Sounds like a ball hog to me. Never won the sort of championship with them. Was he a sort of centric and or egotistical kind of player, or was it just simply that his was the cog that sort of made that team kind of work, and a lot of it was feeding him and making him sort of the central part of that? Or what was the dynamic, I guess, of that? I'm just
yes,
yeah, because you don't see a whole lot of that. Well, maybe we're ebbing more towards that again in this modern era lately, but I'm just curious as to why he arguably was so successful. Obviously, his talent was unmatched, but
pleased to address it. Number one, he was egocentric, and so was Babe Ruth and Bobby Orr and LeBron James and Bobby Bonds, et cetera, great athletes, great ice skaters, great pole vaulters, great boxers, Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, et cetera, are egocentric. The question is, was Wilt a team player? And the answer is absolutely he was a team player. So why did he score so many points? Because the coach and owner told him to. He needed to for his team to be competitive. That's the crux of the issue for why Wilt Chamberlain and the teams on which he played, first the Warriors, then in San Francisco, and then ultimately with the Lakers, lost so many times to Bill Russell and Red Auerbach and the Boston Celtics. And my answer in the book, I devote a lot of pages to it, is there are 9 reasons why. The 9 reasons are that Red Auerbach, Bill Russell played with 8 other Hall of Famers, great players who are in the Hall of Fame, and their coach, Red Auerbach, who's in the Hall of Fame. Wilt had to score 25 or 30% of the team's points for them to be competitive. If he didn't, they would have lost by even more than the totals that they lost to Boston in those years. Boston had a great balanced team. That's what teams are. The great Yankee teams, the great Dodger teams of the 50s and 60s, my era when I was a teenager, always have great offense and defense. The Celtics had great defense, starting with Russell. Tom Sanders, one of the league's great defensive players. Casey Jones, who replaced Cousy and Heinsohn when they retired, great defensive player. Great 6-man coming off the bench, John Havlicek, before he became a starter. They were a balanced team, guys. The great 1961-62 Celtics had 5 or 6 men, it's in the book, who had averaged double figures. Wilt didn't have the supporting cast that Boston did. And there's a great quote. One of my favorite interviews was Leonard Coppett, a distinguished sports writer in New York, author of 16 books, who made the point, you win as a team, you lose as a team. No one, and I'm quoting Coppett here, not Babe Ruth, not Michael Jordan, not Bill Russell, wins alone. They need a strong supporting cast. Michael Jordan's first years, they didn't win the NBA title. He didn't have a great supporting cast. He didn't have a Scottie Pippen and other players, Steve Kerr and other great good guards they had. So that's why Boston prevailed over Wilt's teams. Also, Boston had Red Auerbach, arguably the greatest coach in NBA history. Wilt had different coaches, and it's not the same stability. And some of the coaches, frankly, were mediocre. They admitted they were not great coaches, and they lasted a year or two. So that's a whole mouthful on to answer your question. Wilt was a team player, and the proof of that is when he went to the Lakers in their great run, the streak, the longest professional winning streak in North American sports history, his role was diminished. He could play just defense and rebound and score, like 12 points or whatever, 14 points a game, and make the outlet pass to Jerry West and Gail Goodrich. When Wilt had a strong supporting team in the Sixers in 1966-67 and the Lakers in 71-72, he played on two of the greatest teams of that era and the greatest teams ever. Of course, the game's changed a lot, and that's a whole other subject.
Well, sure, and I would say a lot of people would say the 63-64 season, losing the finals, arguably, he was basically you're intimating he carried that team, right? I mean, he was basically the reason why they sort of went as far. I wouldn't say overachieved, but without that, they wouldn't have even sort of been a finalist. And you're mentioning some of the reasons as to why they never go for the hump that year.
A further point on it, it's not just Robert Cherry mouthing off saying why Boston prevailed. I loved Boston. People say they don't know it from reading the book. I was a Boston Celtic fan. I wanted Wilt and the Philly teams to do well, but I loved the team basketball that they played. I was going to make an important. Many sports writers and referees, I quote them in the book, make that point about that Wilt's team were not as good as the Celtics. And lastly, and most importantly, I think it was somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 newspaper articles in researching the book. Wilt's teams were not favored to beat Boston in all those series, except in 66, 67, 68, 69, where they lost it and blew it, and I criticized the team, the coach, and Wilt for that year. And then the Laker team. So for the 14 years of his career, there were only two or three teams that were strong and favored to win the NBA title, and two of the three times they won the title. This is from reading the Philly, the New York, Los Angeles, and Boston papers, especially the Philly papers. They were not shocked that the Celtics would prevail.
All right, I want to fast forward in a minute to get to L.A. because that's where a lot of this other sort of unknown, sort of forgotten league stuff sort of really comes into play. But one just quick question. When the Warriors started to hit on some financial issues and were looking to get rid of some players and they sold Wilt, why Philadelphia? I mean, did he want to go back to Philadelphia now that this 76ers franchise was coming into play, or was it just irony that he was being traded to Philadelphia and back, quote unquote, home?
No, it wasn't irony. Ike Richman and Irv Kozloff had bought the Syracuse National franchise and brought pro basketball back to one of the premier and original NBA cities in Philadelphia. And he was Wilt's lawyer. There's a certain conflict of interest there. He was Wilt's lawyer and he was Wilt's employer when Wilt came back to Philly. That's why Wilt didn't want to come back to Philly from San Francisco. And Ike Richman talked him in it. And indeed, that's a whole other subject. When he was in Philly for a few of those years with the Philadelphia 76ers, he lived in New York and commuted to Philly, which is a half-assed situation and should never have been allowed to happen. But they were the terms that Wilt demanded. Eventually, saw the light, and for the 66-67 season, rented an apartment in Center City. But the earlier years, he commuted from New York during this famous 100-point game and averaging 50.4 games a year in 1961-62. Wilt Chamberlain lived in New York and took the train or drove from New York to Philly.
Interesting. So cosmopolitan was certainly creeping into the lexicon of Wilt, right? So and maybe that is a little bit of that's kind of a bit of a revelation because it does maybe get into the psyche a bit of this guy, especially when he gets to L.A., right, which is sort of another sort of flavor of sort of cosmopolitanness, because the Lakers, of course, that's when, really we were talking about when the sort of first sort of real dominant star-studded era sort of came about. I'm just wondering if this is the beginnings of sort of, or true evidence, right? it feels to me like he's got a lot of interests outside of the game of basketball proper, right? And it seems maybe that's partially driving why he's commuting from New York and maybe ultimately winding up in L.A. years.
No, it wasn't yes, he had interest. He owned a nightclub in Harlem. What was it? Wilt's Small's Paradise, a famous club that went back to the, I think, 40s, a black club. The whites hung out there. He always had interest outside of basketball. He got involved in harness racing, and in fact, one of the owners of the San Francisco Warriors, and Wilt owned a harness racehorse, a great racehorse. There was only one problem. There was an even greater racehorse at that time. But Wilt just loved the vibe of New York, as zillions of other people have loved it over the years. The vibe, the sparkle, the pizzazz, the nightlife, the excitement, the restaurants, everything, as I said earlier. And same in L.A. He loved the climate. He got into volleyball, beach volleyball, rehabbing a torn tendon in his knee, and he loved that in his post-basketball career. That's how he spent his time on the beach at Santa Monica, playing cards and jiving with people and bantering. He was a very social person, and he loved the volleyball life.
All right, so let's get into that. You opened the door very nicely to that, and I appreciate that. So we're fast forwarding now to sort of the latter years of the NBA career, this being in Los Angeles, obviously a championship season in the midst of that, 71-72, the Jerry Buss era getting underway, and the fabulous, all kinds of great stuff. And we've had a bunch of conversations with some of the folks involved with the Fabulous Forum at the time. But this is also some of the seeds of Wilt's playing career kind of nearing its end, maybe a little bit of maybe against his will, or perhaps some of injuries and all that kind of stuff. But some other things you're sort of hinting at sort of coming into the picture. Let's, before we get into the volleyball thing, because that in of itself is fascinating, tell me about sort of the I guess the end of the Lakers sort of situation and this dalliance, I guess, with the ABA, which obviously was still quite fledgling in the early 70s. It feels to me like this was essentially a bit of something new to try, maybe than just simply coming back and trying to help the Lakers win yet another, championship.
Part of it was that filthy word money. The San Diego Conquistadors, we'll shorten it to the Qs.
The Qs, yeah.
They offered him a boatload of money to become a player coach, and Wilt was all for it. There was one problem. There was the option clause in basketball, which has since been removed. The option clause gave a team the option for 1 year after a player's contract was up. So Wilt had run through his contract with the Lakers, and he said, I want to go be a player coach in San Diego. They're going to pay me a bundle of money. I want a new experience. And the Lakers, through their lawyer and their owner, said, wait a second, Wilt, you can't. If you play basketball next year, it has to be for the Los Angeles Lakers. After 1 more year, then you're a free man. Now, this was a ridiculous law, since rescinded rule, but that's the way it was. So Wilt just became the coach of the Conquistadors, the Qs. He was not a player. He was forbidden.
Did he know? So, and we've had a lot of conversations around the ABA. We had Dennis Murphy on a couple of episodes talking about all of that, and you can hear and smell, if you will, the questionable finances sort of in the background of what you just said, possibly. But how much did Wilt sort of know? I mean, or frankly, the Conquistadors ownership know or let on about this situation, right? Because I can't imagine he would have been that completely in the dark to make this sort of move and agreement without kind of knowing that this reserve thing or this option thing was going to kind of bite him in the butt, or so how much of, I guess, would you say he knew that this situation would get thorny or didn't?
I don't know. And when I don't know something, I acknowledge it. I don't know the answer to your question. All I know is that it ended up, maybe he thought I'm Wilt Chamberlain, I'll hire an expensive lawyer and I'll beat it or whatever. But the courts upheld the option clause, and that was that. Wilt was the player coach, 1973-74.
Yeah, and I got to think that, the ownership group, right, this is a guy coming off another NBA Finals, right? This is a guy coming off of leading the league in scoring, right? Again, field goal percentage. I mean, this guy was certainly, trailing off from his peak, but he still was absolutely very vital and a catch, so to speak.
I agree, but the owner, I think it was a dentist who hit a jackpot someplace. It was just a shaky financial league, as you know, and eventually folded, and 4 of the teams were incorporated into the NBA. New York Nets, Denver Nuggets, I forget the other 2. And there's some great players in the NBA. Dr. J, George Irving, the Iceman, Connie Hawkins. With the Conquistadors, if I may, Wilt being Wilt, again, I criticize him for this. He commuted by helicopter and small plane from Los Angeles to San Diego. And I understand you don't want to drive I've done that trip. It's 3 hours when there's normal traffic. It could be 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, it looks easy on the map until you get on the freeway. And Wilt had Stan Albeck, a respected basketball man. Yeah, let's talk about that, because it's almost like he kind of just ceded the operations in many respects to Albeck, no? Yeah, he did. Stan did all the X's and O's, but Wilt is no dummy, and as Alex Hannum, one of the great NBA coaches, I don't know, these names will mean nothing to many young listeners, but take my word for it. Alex Hannum was a great coach, won the title with the Sixers in 66, 67, and took the San Francisco Warriors. One year they failed the only year of Wilt's career they played on a losing team with a losing record, their first year in San Francisco. And the next year, Alex Hannum took them to the Western Division title. My point. So Wilt flies in wearing expensive Italian-made loafers and expensive clothes. He loved to dress up. Stan Albeck ran the team, ran the practices, but Wilt was a good basketball man, and even John Wooden learned something from Wilt. Coaches were always saying, I can handle that player, I learned how to handle so-and-so. And Wilt said, don't say that about a player. It makes them sound like it's a zoo, and you're a lion trainer handling someone. Wilt knew basketball. Alex Hannum said that he knew well, but he had so many other interests, and Wilt would fly in, and there'd be a beautiful actress at the practice. Let me tell you a great anecdote, one of my many, many favorites about Wilt in the book. He's coaching, he comes to practice, and the basketball gets caught in the guide wire, and the players are trying to jump up and knock it out, and they're ready to get a chair and stand on it. These are 6'6", 6'11", Caldwell Jones, a real jumping jack. He couldn't get the ball down. Wilt gets there and mumbles. He said, why don't you knock the ball down? He said, Wilt, we tried. We can't knock the ball out of the guide wire. Wilt starts bitching and muttering to himself or something. Put the money on the floor and I'll collect it. He takes his shoes off and his bare feet. He jumps up and knocks the ball loose, and all the players' jaws drop. Well, I love more than anything, I love hearing and then recounting in the book the examples of Wilt's almost superhuman strength and stamina. And I urge your listeners, go to YouTube. There weren't YouTube videos in abundance when I wrote the book. There's some amazing videos of Wilt showing his strength and players bouncing off of him, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mr. Universe, saying Wilt was the strongest man I ever knew, and he picked me up with one hand and threw me, etc. Well, you say in the book, you quote Stan Albeck as saying that essentially he sort of came across as being indifferent to bored even with sort of the X's and O's. And I guess there was even this autobiography that was out of his that he was Allback seems to recall that he seemed to be a little bit more interested in promoting versus, where the team was going to be playing next and matching up against the next competitor.
Yeah, all that's true. I mean, Wilt, though the players had nice memories of Wilt, and he chewed them out when appropriate, and he was he didn't roll over for a player, but his heart wasn't into it, and that's why he only did it for 1 year.
Why? And I know that the Qs they did knock it out in terms of attendance and all that kind of stuff. And there were a lot of floundering franchises in and around that. Why did Wilt hang it up after that? You would think that maybe he would still want to figure out a way to play because his now year in purgatory was essentially up, and maybe the coaching thing could have been more of a full-time thing now that he knew. I'm just curious as to why he didn't continue to maybe pick up playing again.
He was of basketball. He had so many other interests in life, and he had taken a beating. People beat the hell out of Wilt, and refs didn't call fouls all the time. Like Wilt was so much more dominant than other players. He was tired of basketball. He had hurt his knee. He had his teeth smashed in by Clyde Lavelle many years before. He was run up the court. He didn't have the lateral movement that he had before he got older, and he tore his patella tendon. And that's an interesting point about, for me it was interesting, about Jabbar and Wilt. I think Jabbar is the second greatest big man, and they competed against each other. Jabbar's 10 years younger than Wilt, and I contend, and same with Shaq, the other contender for who was greater than Wilt. Wilt could outjump Jabbar and Shaq. He had much more stamina than both of them. He was much greater on defense than both of them. No disrespect. I mean, Jabbar was unbelievable and had a better temperament in many respects than Wilt. And was even more of a team player and less of a troublemaker. So to answer your question, summary, he was tired of it. He played since he was a kid. He had many other things he wanted to do with his life, and he did it.
Yeah, and clearly he had a lot of just all kinds of other things going on near the tail end of his playing and or semi-coaching career, right? Yeah, and being in L.A., right? So the entertainment industry and doing commercials for various, advertisers and all kinds of stuff, right?
All wide bodies start out roomy. Then, on most airlines, that space fills up. But on TWA, it's different. TWA has a separate business class that's spacious and comfortable, and it's on every wide-body flight. TWA's ambassador class has bigger, wider seats and fewer of them, with room for longer legs and wider bodies. Couldn't have said it better myself.
You're gonna like us, TWA.
Yes, why schlep to Boston or Philly or New York in the middle of the winter when you could be on the beach in Santa Monica, or you could be in Hawaii next to L.A., the volleyball mecca, and all these beautiful women. And, there was talk about Wilt coming back to play for the Knicks and the Cleveland Cavaliers. And as I say in the book, no disrespect to Cleveland, but Wilt would much prefer being in a warm climate than being in Cleveland in wintertime.
All right. Well, let's talk about sort of that sort of last major sort of pro sports exploit of his, because we hinted at it before. Volleyball was arguably a therapeutic exercise for him, literally and figuratively, and a recreational thing at that. And I'm guessing that sort of really kind of came into its own when he was playing for the Lakers. But it really took on a whole new set of circumstances in life once the Conquistadors thing was over, or maybe sort of in conjunction with it.
In conjunction, correct. He grew to love volleyball to the point where he played with a professional team and they toured the country. And as the great Gene Selznick, one of the great players of that era, said, Wilt did more for volleyball than anybody else in the 50 years that Selznick was associated with the sport. People loved to come out and watch Wilt play, and he would banter and smile. He was more relaxed. No one was criticizing him for not winning the title, for not scoring 90 points. And he started, as I said earlier, rehabbing his knee when he tore the tendon. And then he loved the game. And Wilt promoted the game. He promoted a girls' team. I'll read to you a great quote I found. I was looking this morning or yesterday. Kathy Gregory, an All-American volleyball player who teamed with Wilt in 2-on-2 tournaments. She recalled Wilt's incredible stamina and how he dove for shots. Quote, when he left the beach, half the beach left with him. If Wilt got in my car, it would take 5 weeks to get the sand out. End of quote.
Well, yeah, I mean, he certainly. It's hard not to make a presence wherever you go, anyway. Being of his size, stature, and star wattage, but I gotta think that he made just every sort of pickup game on the beaches of Southern California. It just kind of a mini event, whether he liked it or not.
Yes, it did. And I have friends. My college roommate was on the beach in California. He saw Wilt walking. So I've met a number of people over the years who relate a Wilt encounter, and it was on the beach in California, which he loved. He was a hedonistic athlete. He loved the rhythm. When he was retired and didn't have to go to basketball practice, he'd sleep until 10 or 11. He didn't sleep much. He had insomnia. He'd drive his station wagon. Sometimes his 2 Great Danes would be with him. And he'd go to the Santa Monica and another beach, I forget it. And I visited the beach in the 3 trips I took to L.A. to interview his basketball and volleyball buddies and his executor of his will and dear friend Cy Goldberg, his lawyer. Wilt would hang out. They would play cards. He cheated at cards. Everybody knew it. He cheated in all games, but not in basketball. And that's an important point to make. And I address that in the book. He would be there all day. Look, Wilt loved women, as lots of men love women, and there are scantily clad women there, great athletes. Wilt was attracted to athletic women who were in shape, took care of their body. They'd play basketball, and they'd hang out on the beach all day. Not a bad life. And then he went to Hawaii. He owned a condo there. He played beach volleyball. He played some basketball with one of the University of Hawaii basketball team. He got free. He was a very social animal. People liked him. There's a great quote from Dick Schaap, the renowned sports writer and commentator, who said, Russell's politics were closer to mine than Wilt's were, but Russell was just not a lovable person, and Wilt was a lovable giant. And that really does sum up Wilt's persona, his personality. I interviewed all of these close friends and associates, and Wilt could be a pain in the ass and very demanding. They all had wonderful memories of Wilt, his generosity, his fun, his bass voice, his refusal to acknowledge when he was wrong on something. Just nice memories. They weren't criticizing him when they well could have. So getting back to volleyball, he toured with a professional team. He sponsored a women's team. He put it on the map, and he's inducted into the Volleyball Hall of Fame, which I visited as part of my research in Holyoke, Mass. And there are very few athletes, maybe you know them, that know the name, who are in 2 Hall of Fames. Wilt, of course, in basketball, and 10 miles away in Holyoke, Mass, the volleyball. I don't know if Jim Brown is in the lacrosse Hall of Fame. He was one of the greatest.
Yeah, I think he is.
Yeah, then he would be in the 2 Hall of Fames. And I don't know if Bo Jackson, I don't think he's in. Anyway.
So from what your research was able to uncover, so we've had a couple of episodes devoted to the International Volleyball Association. Jay Hanseth, great player, and Mike Jacobs, who did a wonderful 30 for 30 on the IVA as well. From what you can tell, do you have any sort of more understanding of how Wilt got more front and center involved with this International Volleyball Association? I mean, I think it's lost on a whole lot of people that there was some big names involved in getting this thing started up. I mean, Barry Diller and Barry Gordy of Motown Records, and there was a whole sort of Southern California sort of investor sort of base there that was intrigued with this idea of co-ed volleyball at a professional level. And I think 76, the Olympics, as a lot of sports tend to kind of sort of showcase, is that maybe there could be something here on the professional ranks. I mean, there's no question that if I'm trying to figure out a way to professionalize a sport like this, right? And I know of one of the world's most famous athletes being a crack volleyball player in his spare time, and how much he loves the game just innately. It seems like almost kismet to be able to sort of find this kind of person to maybe be the front man, if you will, for something fledgling like this.
You know more about it than I, and it was interesting for me to hear you talk about it. I address it briefly in the book, but don't go into much detail. Is that the one that never took off? There was a volleyball association with which Wilt was associated. The one I know more about and interviewed people was when he was touring with Gene Selznick and Keith Erickson, the great basketball player, and some other well-known, Larry Rundle, from that period. So I'm not the person to speak on that.
Yeah, David Wolper was kind of the guy really behind the IVA. He was a prolific TV and film producer, and he was the guy behind Roots and the Thornbirds and Willy Wonka, the original movie, and all that stuff. And I think he became smitten with the sport when he was, I guess, doing some 1972 Olympics documentary footage and stuff. But yeah, I mean, he was, literally courted by all those folks and others. The desire was, and again, this was also around the same time, right, where you had a ton of challenger leagues and fledgling pro sports propositions, right? People like Gary Davidson and the folks behind the ABA and the World Hockey Association and World Football. So, why not, right? It's like now is the time. And but it's interesting because there's some great pictures sort of floating around there of Wilt. And I guess it depends on who you ask. I mean, to your point earlier, we talked to people like Jay Hanseth, who was, one of the star players of that league. And he almost mimics what you just said. He's a great guy, gregarious, fun to be around, excellent athlete, one of the best players he's ever seen. But this question, he was, depending on the time you ask and the data that you sort of filter through, he was at once or at the same time the commissioner of this league, a co-owner of this league, a player in this league, a coach in this league, the ambassador for this league. On some occasions, all of them. And I guess it just, for whatever reasons, never really sort of fully stuck. But this was a guy, I mean, I think true to his nature, and I think in a lot of his basketball exploits too, he shows up, the spotlights come along with him. When he's not there,
Exactly. And you've piqued my interest in learning more about it. You do a very nice job of explaining his role.
For our listeners and for you, our episode's number 138 with Jay Hanseth, and number 9, we talked to the gentleman behind Bump and Spike, which is the 30 for 30 short.
I'll make an observation that I do write, quote myself in the book, from talking to the people with whom he played volleyball. He was a good volleyball player, not a great one. He didn't come to the game until his 30s. And as I quote one of them saying, his hands were too big to set up the ball properly. Now, that's not to say his great athleticism. When Wilt smashed the ball, I wouldn't want to be near it or spiked it or defending a spike. So his technique, and I don't fault it for that. Wilt was an amazing athlete, always doing something physical. When besides volleyball, as he got older, playing racquetball, playing tennis, playing paddleball, playing polo. We owned a polo pony, running 5 or 6 miles a day. Can I tell another Wilt story if we have time, an anecdote?
Please. And I guess we can sort of put it against the, and we'll get you connected, by the way, with Mike Jacobs, who did the documentary, and Jay Hanseth, if you're interested for that well-anticipated extra chapter, perhaps, on that. Just maybe sort of put all of that sort of in context, I guess, to Wilt's, I wouldn't call it wandering eye, although I guess I could, right, because there is that sort of angle of his life for sure, wink, wink. But it's obviously this is a guy who's, I would call it a short attention span, but he's got a lot of interests, right? Would you call him a Renaissance man, or would you?
I call Leonardo da Vinci a Renaissance man, I just think he was a very interesting, talented, intelligent. He wasn't a genius, well-read. The last month of his life, he was learning to play the saxophone or the xylophone. One of them, I have it correct in the book. He was a neat guy. I mean, like all people, he had his strengths and weaknesses. He was larger than life, to pick a phrase out of nowhere. Of course, that's the name of my book, Wilt, Larger Than Life, if I could plug it. It's just sad to me that a couple of things, that Wilt didn't have children. All of his friends said he loved kids, and there's some neat pictures of Wilt with kids. You could, the affection he had. And I think, like a lot of people, he would have been happy had he married. But as Cy Goldberg, who knew him as well as anybody the last 30 years of his life, Cy Goldberg was his lawyer in L.A. and friend, buddy. They ate dinner, Cy with his wife and Wilt, with a date or alone, many, many, many times. Cy said that Wilt's lifestyle didn't lend itself to marriage. And Wilt made the, of course, notorious statement of betting 20,000 women. And he also would reiterate that he also said it's better to make love to one woman 1,000 times than 1,000 women one time. And he was a big proponent of birth control. And to the best of my knowledge, when I wrote the book in Cy Goldberg's, there were no little illegitimate or legitimate Wilties running around. Though there's an article in Sports Illustrated claiming to be Wilt's son. That's a whole other issue, and I don't address that. All that happened after my book was published in 2004. But this anecdote I wanted to tell was Stan Lorber is great. I loved interviewing him, one of my favorite. He was Wilt's doctor for many years and then just an advisor, and Wilt would visit Stan in Palm Beach, Florida, where Stan retired. Stan was the 76er doctor. They were all friends, all connected. Ike Richman, Eddie Gottlieb, Wilt, Stan Lorber. Anyway, Stan's first wife died. He's happily remarried. He's deceased. Wilt says, you're down in the dumps. Your first wife is going, I want to take you to Italy. I'll pay for everything. They go to Italy. They're two great anecdotes I love. I don't know if you want to hear both, but this one, Wilt would run 5 or 6 miles a day. He did it. They're in a hotel. Wilt's drenched. He comes in, and he's famished. Not dehydrated, but he's thirsty. And he says to them, bring me some orange juice. And this is Italy, and they bring this little 4-ounce glass of orange juice, freshly squeezed, I'm sure. And Wilt looks at it stunned, and he says, how many do you have? Bring me every glass you have. And they bring Wilt 144 ounces of orange juice, 36 small 4-ounce glasses. And Stan Lorber relates to me how Wilt just took them down one after another, not coming up for air. I love that anecdote.
Well, I think it's funny. I think it's funny too that they had to put it in all those small glasses. They couldn't put it into a large container. That's the funnier part.
That's true too. And of course, the staff is watching, and their mouth, people's jaw drops open all the time with Wilt's exploits. And the other thing is that on that trip, Stan Lorber told me they went to Florence, and that Wilt, just like millions of others, including me, fell in love with the David statue. And Stan Lorber was thinking to himself that Wilt was probably saying, there's a guy built, if anybody's familiar with Michelangelo's David statue, there's a guy who's built as well as I am.
So he had a bit of a, not only an ego, but probably also a winking sense of humor too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And Wilt, being physical, was central to his being. There's no getting around it. And when he got older and one ailment after another hit, it was difficult for him to live with it.
All right, last question. In your opinion, do you think he was essentially, just because of his size, destined to be a basketball player, or do you think he could have done other, top-tier, all-star, Hall of Fame career type athletic exploits, either instead or as well? I mean, volleyball obviously was, more of a thing sort of later in his career. But I mean, obviously basketball was part of his life just because of who he physically was, whether he wanted to or not, right? It's obviously a gift. But do you think he could have done other things too, or instead than just basketball?
And I love your question. I thought about it even many years after I wrote the book. I think about the question. Wilt became a basketball player because that's where the money was in those days when he grew up in Philadelphia. Number one. Even after his first season, and this wasn't idle talk or speculation on people or rumor, he talked about retiring. He said, I think I can be a world class, and I quote him, I think I could break the world decathlon record. And Robert Cherry thinks that Wilt could have been a medalist in the decathlon in the 60 or 64 Olympics, provided that a pole vault, the technology, would have allowed someone who weighed 260, 270 to pole vault, that it wouldn't snap. Wilt loved track. It was his first and most enduring love, more than women, more than volleyball, more than basketball. He loved track. He sponsored a girls' young women's track team in San Diego. Wilt seriously considered fighting at Muhammad Ali, but his accountant, Alan Levitt, whom I interviewed many times, talked him out of it as they were about to sign the contract. Imagine Wilt, he tried out with the Kansas City the football team, Hank Stram. Imagine Wilt an end with his reach and his grip, one hand catching a ball. So I think that in another life and later on, Wilt would have retired. This is just me speculating, that I would have loved him to retire after 5 years and become a world famous and gold medal decathlete. Every pro team and college team, his fellow players talked to me about his stamina and strength. He was the fastest man in that famous basketball drill where you run up and down from one side of the court to the other. Wilt beat the guards. Al Adels told me that. He was a high jumper in high school. He won a high school meet at Kansas with very little practice. He would have learned to throw the shot put in the discus because of his strength and become world class. So, and the last thing, and a major point to make about Wilt Chamberlain, I think that it's sad, personally I think this, that he didn't play an individual sport. He was an individual, a sport where he could have shown. Not that he didn't in basketball, but he got all this solace and grief for not winning every single game because he was Superman, expected to do. He would have been a much more satisfied person if he played an individual sport. And he had the athletic ability, the strength and stamina, and hand-eye coordination to excel in other avenues.
All right, I told you that was going to be interesting, and there's no doubt that the life and times of Wilt Chamberlain continue to fascinate, even in the years after his passing. Obviously, a legend on the hardwood, a tremendous player on the volleyball court, maybe even a legend in the bedroom for all we know and remember of his life story. All of it and more is encompassed in the great, authoritative, and definitive, according to the late Dick Schaap, book on the history and the story of Wilt Chamberlain, written by our guest this week, Robert Cherry. It is called Wilt, Larger Than Life. It is published by Triumph Books. It is found, of course, wherever good books are found, all those various places. But, of course, if you'd like to give us a few shekels of referral love, to keep our lights on and keep the heat or the air conditioning going, depending on the season here. We appreciate if you decided to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and just search up this episode with Robert Cherry and our conversation about Wilt, and you'll find a convenient link that'll take you right to Amazon. It's probably the quickest way that you can get it, either in digital or hardcover or paperback form, and we'll get a couple of coins to put into our coffers and pay some bills around here. We appreciate that very much. While you're on the website, goodseatsstillavailable.com, by all means, make sure that you find our social media sites and follow us, will you? On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. You will also, on the website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, find the convenient link to sign up to our weekly email newsletter. Just your name and your email address. It's all we need. We don't share with anybody. And boom, you're on the list. What else? You will find on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com our email link, but you can also send it to us directly if you'd like. And we're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Easy peasy. Let's see. Our thanks, of course, this week to our longtime pal, Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne. Yes, Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. That's what I'm trying to say. We thank you, kind sir, for your twiddling of knobs, etc. this week. And let's leave you now with just a sheer gift from the internet gods, shall we? I don't know who posted this, but oh my God, this is just perfect for a way to go out of this episode. Did you know, amongst the zillions of things that Wilt Chamberlain was interested in and tried in his amateur and professional careers, plural, was singing and releasing a 45 RPM record? Well, whoever was the promotional genius and agent at the time, in 1960, when Wilt was just kind of starting to show his prowess with the Philadelphia Warriors, he released a song, 2 songs actually. It was a 2-sided RPM 45, of course. The A side was a tune called "By the River," which is fine, and you know it's okay. It's a passable song, but we kind of like the B side, and it's there on YouTube. You can find it. It's labeled as Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain. We know he hated the term the stilt, but who knows the things going on in terms of like why. But whoever thought why this would be a good idea in the first place? Because I'm not sure Wilt was the best singer, but you know what? He gave it the good old college try, and I think he probably did a good 95% better than anybody else could, average singers out there. And here it is. It's called "That's Easy to Say." That's the name of the tune. It's on End Records. And let's send you out. Here's Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain singing us out. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care. See you next week.
That's easy to say, but I'm gonna do it. So hard to do. Oh yeah. Gonna quit my smoking, gonna quit my drinking, start life anew. That's easy to say, but I'm gonna do it. So hard to do. Oh. Gonna quit my loafing, gonna get a job, work hard at it too. That's easy to say, but I'm gonna do it. So hard to do. Oh. Gonna turn a new leaf over. We don't believe you, not for a minute. I'm gonna stop being such a rover. That's nice, but your heart isn't in it. Gonna give up hugging, gonna give up kissing. With love I'm through. That's easy to say, but I'm gonna do it. So hard to do. Oh. You gotta quit your loafing, you gotta get a job, you gotta start life anew. That's easy to say, oh, but so hard to do. Oh. Gonna turn a new leaf over. We don't believe you, not for a minute. I'm gonna stop being such a rover. That's nice, but your heart isn't in it. Gonna give up hugging, gonna give up kissing. With love I'm through. That's easy to say, but I'm gonna do it. So hard to do. Though I'm used to it. That's easy to say. Promise my mother. So hard to do. Gonna be a good boy. It's easy to say. Gee, I'm thirsty. So hard to do. Hey girl, you got a light?